Let's begin with the first design pattern. We're going to discuss one of the most important design patterns in the gaming industry, the command pattern. But first, let me introduce the gaming programming pattern book written by Robert Nystrom. This video is heavily inspired by this book. If you love this content and want to learn more about gaming and programming pattern, or just support Robert Nystrom, you will find a link to this amazing book in the description. In my opinion, it's one of the best programming books I have ever encountered. Plus, its back cover is also one of the most amazing I have ever seen. What is happening when a player presses a button on its controller? Well, obviously the hero controlled by him does an action. The simplest way for a programmer to design an action during the game is by setting request to a specific button on the connected controller. For instance, when a specific button is pressed during the game, the hero might jump, shoot, or perform another specific action. Well, the straightforward method is to directly assign to each button the request action with a static function. Although this solution works perfectly, it has limitations. The first limitation is that the player cannot reassign request action on different buttons during the game, because of static function linked to the controlled button. To do that, the player would have to manually change the setting inside the input handler code himself. The second limitation appears when we think of time buffering. Because actions are directly triggered when buttons are pressed, we cannot easily add time between the request and the associated action without modifying the static function, which is pretty much difficult. Let's now talk about the third limitation. Imagine you play a game that needs to undo command done. This is not straightforward to do this. By chance, the command pattern can easily resolve this limitation once it's built. The main idea behind the pattern is to decouple request from action. Let's look at how to implement this solution. The earlier straightforward solution directly attaches a static function to each button on the controller. To decouple action from request, the command pattern is used. It first wraps request into an object and then uses an object-oriented programming technique called polymorphism. These wrap requests are then derived from an abstract base class, and requests are assigned under the same virtual function for each requested object. Now, instead of directly assigning requests to each button, we assign a pointer to the abstract base class, which is named command for each button on our example. Now, when a button is pressed, we don't directly call the request with the static function. Instead, we call the object's virtual function that triggers the request. You might wonder why all of this is necessary, as it seems to accomplish the same thing as the straightforward solution with static function. Well, you're partially right. It does the same thing, but now, by wrapping our request in an object and using polymorphism, we can reassign request object during runtime to each different button on the controller. Now, gamer can pause the game and reassign different actions to their controller's button, which could not be done with the direct call of static function. This solution resolves the dynamic reassignment of different actions, but with this implementation, we cannot delay action from their request or undo any command. This issue is mainly due to the coupling between the request object and the action itself, even though we solve the reassignment problem. We did not completely decouple the object request and the action. We need to slightly modify the previous implementation to fully decouple these two things. Let's now explore the full implementation of the command pattern to address this issue. And if you don't know what is polymorphism or object-oriented programming, and if you have ever been interested in learning programming through C++, I have created an extensive course featuring hours of animation video to visualize what happened under each C++ instruction. This course includes live coding exercise and more to help you practice this amazing programming language. It ranges from how to install and use a compiler to object-oriented programming covering 9 modules. Visit eisenbugs.dev to check out my course. And now let's come back to our command pattern. Now let's look at the full implementation of the command pattern. This implementation will fully decouple the object request from its action. To do this, we modify how actions are triggered. Instead of directly executing the object request virtual function that trigger its request like with the first implementation, we simply return the request object itself. It might seem odd to return this object without executing its virtual function directly, but now we have fully decoupled the request from its action. By doing so, we can solve many problems that the first implementation couldn't. For example, by adding a delay queue between the return object request and its action, we can introduce delay between them and so resolve the delay issue we had with the first issue. So far we have only considered the player-driven character, but what about all the other actors in the game? Well, most of the time, they are driven by the game AI. Now, with this implementation, command pattern can let the AI emit object requests and use them to trigger the action of the other game actor. Another great feature of using the command pattern is the ability to undo emitted command. To do this, we simply store the emitted command and use them to undo previous action. We could, for example, store them in a stack, popping off the last command first to undo the most recent action, and so on until the stack is empty. Or rather than a stack, we could use a double linked list with a pointer pointing to the last action made to redo action when the unwanted undo has been made. Well done! If you arrived here, you know now how command pattern is used in game industries. If you are interested in game design pattern, I highly suggest you to buy Game Programming Pattern like I said before, which I consider as one of the most greatest unknown design pattern book. Of course, Design Pattern, also known as Gang of Four, is a great book, but is not as pedagogical as Game Programming Pattern. So I highly suggest you to buy Game Programming Pattern if you are beginner or intermediate learner. Thank you and see you soon with the next videos.